Ready? Good evening, everyone. I'm most happy to see you here. And also, I can't see you online, but I know you're out there. It's good to have you with us this evening for the 47th Antoinette Brown Lecture. It is made possible by a gift from Sylvia Sanders Kelly of Atlanta, Georgia. The lectures began in 1974 and are intended to bring to the school distinguished women theologians to speak on concerns for women in ministry. The lectureship is named for Antoinette Brown, the first woman ordained to the Christian ministry in the United States. Antoinette Louisa Brown Blackwell was born in Henrietta, New York on May 20th, 1825, and began to speak publicly in the services of the local Congregational Church at age 9. She was graduated from Oberlin College in 1847 and completed its theological seminary in 1850, though she was not granted her degree. Oberlin later conferred on her an honorary Master of Arts in 1878 and a Doctor of Divinity in 1908. Refused ordination at first because of her sex, she held a Congregationalist pastorate in South Butler, New York for 4 years. She became the first ordained woman minister in the United States on her ordination on September 15th, 1853, but was dismissed in July 1854, evidently by her own wish. She later became a Unitarian. In 1856, she married Samuel C. Blackwell, whose brother, Henry B. Blackwell, had married her Oberlin College friend, Lucy Stone. The family settled in New Jersey. Mrs. Blackwell preached frequently in Unitarian and other liberal pulpits. Active as a speaker and writer for women's rights, temperance, abolition of slavery, and other causes, she preached her last sermon when she was 90 years old, and her last book appeared when she was 93. She died in Elizabeth, New Jersey on November 5th, 1921, at the age of 96. Celebrating the Oberlin roots of the Divinity School, we are pleased to offer this lectureship in Antoinette Brown's honor. This year's lecturer is Reverend Dr. Traci C. West, who is a scholar activist and serves as the James W. Pearsall Professor of Christian Social Ethics and African American Studies at Drew University Theological School in New Jersey. Her teaching, research, and activism have focused on gender, racial, and sexuality justice, particularly related to gender violence. In addition to her many published articles, book chapters, and books, most recently, she is the author of Solidarity and Defiant Spirituality, Africana Lessons on Religion, Racism, and Ending Gender Violence. She is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. We pray for her. Where she has previously been involved with organizing that centers the voices of queer, transgender, and people of color in the struggle for LGBTQIA equality in the church. Her lecture this evening, Misogynist Stench in Christian White Supremacy. I like that title. Is apt for our alarming times that have seen ill-formed notions of Christianity cloaked in supremacist rhetoric, belief, and action. After the lecture, we will have a short question and answer period for those who are in person and online, and that will then be followed by a reception in the atrium. It is my great honor to yield the podium to a great colleague, Traci C. West.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dean Towns. This is really wonderful to have an opportunity. I'm honored to be the 2023 Antoinette Brown Lecturer. And hello to those of you who are live streaming and online. And of course, hello to those of you who are here, who are present in the room. I want to also thank Ms. Shatika Brown. Where are you? Yes. For all of the generosity and patience and efficiency and kindness in working through all the details. If you ever go visit somebody or you go to speak somewhere and sometimes they tell you, oh, yeah, just go find wherever the lecture is or what. And so just to be treated and make so beautifully and smoothly. So I thank you. The conversation that we're going to have today, I want to just point out that it deliberately tarries in uncomfortable and disturbing histories and current realities. It can evoke intense physical and emotional and spiritual and political responses. I will be talking with you about racist brutality, about gender violence, about sexual reproductive harm. Okay, so where are we headed in this conversation? I want to think about gendered coercion as a Christian white supremacist project, and to just think through, talk with you about a few examples of that. And then to think about racist misogyny and how it teaches us that a stench does not smell, and then just a really few brief comments about solidarity practices. And what it means to resist misogyny in those practices. And examples of boldness and cautions. But I just want to begin just a second. I just need a second. Does anybody can, well, that's really awful. Is anybody beside Dr. Dyson, can you smell that? It's overpowering. Am I the only one? It's rough. Like, the presence, it's overpowering. It's visceral. And that's a problem, isn't it? That most of the time we can't even catch a whiff of it, even though it permeates our moral sensibilities, our way of being and doing. Stench, I've been thinking a lot about stench. And I think it's just the metaphor that we need for understanding white supremacy as a cultural process that pervades Christianity in the United States, particularly the drive for political dominance that this process features. It's a hideous stench that impacts everything. In too many ways, white dominance-oriented Christianity has defined faith-filled living, both in terms of the choices that individual Christians make and their collective decision-making in churches, in state agencies, in governing bodies, in businesses, in schools, elsewhere in community life, as with foul odors that fill our nostrils and actively alter our sensory awareness of all that surrounds us. White racist perceptions have determined Christian understandings of human worth and dignity, and the capacity to differentiate between virtuous and heinous acts. Specifically, misogynist targeting lurks in the onslaught of this stench. And I refuse to quietly go along with all the ways that misogyny can easily be relegated to an afterthought. When we're talking about Christian white supremacy, an afterthought when we think about misogyny, or an ancillary effect, it matters, or a happenstance occurrence when we decry Christian white supremacist practices and attitudes and ideas. Oh yeah, it impacted women. It was bad for women too. I refuse that kind of relegation. Racist misogyny has played an essential role, and it is on that role that I want to dwell. Now, this is, being at Vanderbilt, you know, I know that these are all of you are like super smart people. So I am coming with ideas that I'm just beginning to think about, and I want to be in conversation with you. So I want to think about how to define how racist misogyny teaches us, disciplines our thinking, our acting, our imagining, our envisioning, our feelings. I want to focus on its functionality, right? Its functionality in furthering the effects and consequences of white supremacy. Racist misogyny. Here is a definition I'm playing with. It's not there yet. Help me out. Racist misogyny involves a gendering process of targeting femaleness for coercive, social, I added medical, for coercive, social, medical, and religious regulation and control, as well as for physical and sexual abuse and assault in order to bolster Christian white supremacist dominance. The significance of racist misogyny in the U.S. can be found in systemic sanctions. And here's where I'm beginning my thoughts, and I'm working on the relationship between gender violence and reproductive coercion. So there's no secret here. One of the most unique aspects of U.S. chattel slave system that had a lasting legacy as a bedrock of the economic engine that delivered prosperity to this nation was the breeding of enslaved persons by Southern plantation owners. The global Christian project of transatlantic slavery that delivered a few 100,000 Africans, like very few compared to the numbers who came elsewhere in the Americas, particularly to Brazil, so only a few 100,000 Africans, to the settler colonists in the 17th and 18th century, grew to nearly 4 million by 1860. How did that happen? Through a crucial strategy of mass rape and forced pregnancy to reproduce laborers. As Renee K. Harrison pointed out in Enslaved Women and the Arts of Resistance in Antebellum America, the enslaved were caught in, quote, an inescapable bond of involuntary human reproduction. Breeding of enslaved women with enslaved men for the purpose of increasing the labor force was a social norm in antebellum America. And so not just that kind of breeding, but also owners of enslaved persons specialized in using their own bodies, quote, as Harrison says, turning their penises into tools, unquote, to breed with enslaved women. This occurred especially after 1808 when the importation of Africans was outlawed. Harrison cites a formerly enslaved man who remarked, 50 to 60 slave women were kept solely for whites to impregnate them. From these women, 20 to 25 children were born and sold away when they were ready for market, unquote. Women resisted breeding, and they did resist. Those who resisted breeding were severely beaten in public. The reproductive coercion and injustice story in the United States must begin with this systemic sexual violence by white Christians for the sake of Christian white supremacist economic prosperity and dominance. It was key to the nation-building project of settler colonists in creating the wealth of this nation on stolen land from indigenous nations. As the 1619 Project, right, since it's illegal, is it illegal to say that in Tennessee? I'm not sure. As the 1619 Project and many other sources document, quote, slavery allowed this poor fledgling nation to turn into a colossal powerhouse in the global economy, unquote. How did that happen? Where did the labor force come from? This driving system of mass rape and birthing labor in the practice known as breeding produced the workforce. So here we see how, so I'm thinking about function. Racist misogyny functions, right? That in my definition, gendered coercion and assault in service of Christian white supremacy. How it is deployed in these embodied materialist practices. We can understand how this foundational history of brutal, racist misogyny establishes rape and reproductive coercion. Rape and reproductive coercion as standard social, economic, and religious architecture of control in U.S. culture, teaching us there's nothing to smell here. It's just standard. There's nothing to smell here. Such reproductive coercion is explicitly sanctioned in Christian teaching. Right? As we find in Christian scriptures such as 1 Timothy, for Adam was formed first and then Eve, Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor, yet she will be saved through childbearing. For Christians, femaleness can only earn salvation through reproductive labor. In this Christian process of gendering evidenced here, not only cementing hierarchical gender binaries, right, but attaching punitive measure to femaleness that is deserved for her transgression, but with the good reward, right, of God's salvation, only made possible through reproductive labor. The systemic mass rape, reproductive injustice history of breeding in that U.S. chattel system represents a brutal application of this Christian teaching about how to acquire God's salvation. Here, Christianity adds a different approach to the instantiation of racist misogyny in service of supremacist economic domination. Christianity says, stench doesn't smell. Stench smells good. So, right? It teaches us stench smells good. It's a way of earning God's salvation. That's the contribution Christianity makes. And in a much more recent example of how Christianity, I want to cite a much more recent example of how racist misogyny is deployed in practices that are exemplified in the too often ignored history surrounding reproductive health care access, specifically abortion health care access, that occurred soon after the Supreme Court Roe v. Wade in 1973. The amendment introduced by Representative Henry Hyde in 1976, and in effect since 1977, succeeded in eliminating access to abortion for Medicaid recipients and many others dependent on federal health care programs, and remains in place to this day. Now, I've just noted how if you're in this silencing, erasing frame of thinking reproductive justice history and struggle started in the 20th century in the struggle around Roe v. Wade, right? You're way late to the story, really late to the story of racist misogyny and reproductive injustice in U.S. history. And I want to say similarly, if your understanding of the recent Dobbs decision is this is the first time that major national federal curtailing of abortion access occurred, you're simply wrong. Almost immediately, Hyde ended access for nearly 16 million women who were poor. Right? Like for those of us who are activists are sitting here going and watching people just so upset over Dobbs. How could this happen? Right? How could this happen? How could access be denied at a federal level? Are going like, where were you when Hyde was passed? Just a couple years after Roe, right? Ended access for 16 million women who are poor and rely on Medicaid for health services. In 1978, Congress added exceptions to Hyde for, quote, promptly reported rape and incest, as well as severe and long-lasting damage to a woman's health, But then the rape and incest exception was removed in 1981, and later the rape and incest exception was reinstated in 1993. Promptly reported, right? So only the criminal justice authorities can determine whether or not you were raped, right? And then, as legal theorist Brooke McGee explains in her article, Pregnancy as Punishment for Low-Income Sexual Assault Victims, unquote, even the Indian Health Services, like Indian Health Services comes under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, adopted the rape and incest exceptions in 1993 in Hyde, but Native American women were still denied services if they were rape and incest victims. They just refused to comply, right? This lack of compliance affects the health care of nearly 1 million Native American and Alaskan Native women. As the activists for the group Indigenous Women Rising, an Indigenous women's advocacy group, they assert on one of their blogs condemning this treatment by the Indian Health Services for the repeal and call for the repeal of Hyde. This denial of the rape and incest exception occurs in the context of, quote, a population of women who experience the highest rates of rape and incest and sexual and intimate partner violence, unquote. Racist misogyny can be found in these policy shifts of how, quote unquote, early reported rape exception was excluded by Hyde and then later included, and then later included again in the 1990s, and how members of Native Indigenous nations who are dependent on federal health care were never even actually granted the exception for rape and incest. It functions as the political calibration of rapeability in state policy and services targeting Native Indigenous birthing persons at their most traumatized moment, the immediate aftermath of being raped by heterosexual men. The Christianizing goals of Henry Hyde were crucial as he succeeded in implementing his Christian views in federal law with such devastating white supremacist impacts on Indigenous communities. Eulogizing him after his death, one of his supporters noted Hyde's statement about how his Christian faith informed his work, saying, quote, once addressing the National Right to Life Convention, Henry reminded the ground troops of the pro-life movement that they were not playing to the gallery but to the angels, and to him who made the angels, unquote. In this practice, we can see how Christianity aids racist misogyny in the well-rehearsed guise of mission to save the others. Understand, misogyny is not about hate for those targeted. Racist misogyny is not about hatred for those who are targeted, but Christian mission that requires sacrificial traumatizing of those who are not white, not wealthy, in the maintenance of political dominance over the sovereignty of Native indigenous peoples. So my story of Stench would not be complete if I didn't say something about resistance. The overpowering stench to the resistance to the overpowering stench of white supremacy and the ways misogyny services it. So I have a sense that folks around here are accustomed to theorizing from civil rights movement leadership. Yeah. So I'm in the right company here as I invoke Fannie Lou Hamer. In 20th century civil rights history, there are no voices that are bolder than Fannie Lou Hamer's, or more path-breaking in calling attention to the trauma of police physical and sexual abuse, testifying openly, insistently on the physical and sexual abuse that she experienced. My students talk about Me Too as this brand new phenomenon. And I'd say, Fannie Lou Hamer, look up the video of her testimony. And naming the state's role in reproductive coercion practices of sterilization abuse, naming that as a civil rights movement issue. I want to mention one of the instances where Hamer testified. One of the many instances where Hamer testified in her public testimony. And I'll just read this quickly. The other people were testifying about voting rights. And so Hamer certainly is talking about voting rights. But then she says one more thing. One of the other things that happened in Sunflower County, the North Sunflower County Hospital, I would say about 6 out of 10 Negro women that go to the hospital are sterilized with the tubes tied. They're getting up a law that says if a woman has an illegitimate baby and then a second one, they could draw time for 6 months or a $500 fine. What they didn't tell us is that they already doing these things, not only to single women, but to married women. Unquote. The resistance encompassed here includes how she is advocating on the basis of experience. You don't have to go to theories of letting the subaltern speak. You just need to, you need to listen to these activist leaders and how she is creating a movement and advocating on the basis of her own experience of having been sterilized without her consent when she went in for surgery and then woke up and later found out that she had been sterilized, but more broadly about the experience of Negro women across her community, something called a Mississippi appendectomy. And but what I want to emphasize here is the resistance. So not only the stench of the overpowering, right, kind of subjugation that she's up against, but in the midst of that, the ways in which she assails the criminalization of Black poor women for having children, the ways in which she's pointing out the discrepancy between the lies the politicians are telling about the surgery about surgery, and the legislators are saying that's something they're proposing to do, when she's got the reality, this is happening already. And the boldness of her articulation of the gendered embodied reality of reproductive injustice within the broader context of the civil rights movement. One of the things I love about the Lee is the Lee text. There's lots of biographies of Hamer at this point, but I love about the Lee text because it talks about all of the betrayals that Hamer experienced from other leaders, particularly black male leaders in her work, in her activist work, and also the patronizing kind of treatment that she received, and the ways in which she was so insistent. Why isn't Hamer's advocacy against sterilization abuse more routinely included as a primary issue of the civil rights movement? Okay, that's a rhetorical question, I know. But I gotta throw that out there. Why isn't it, when we list what the civil rights movement, Hamer certainly articulated it again and again and again. Finally, my example I want to add of resistance, and that is in this climate of heightened anti-trans attacks, in this political climate here in Tennessee. Yes, here in Tennessee. I'm a little frightened to be here in Tennessee, this really, really repressive targeting, right? Targeting climate. And violence against particularly black and brown trans women. I want to add racist trans misogyny to what I'm talking about here, and how it can function as a formidable repressive resource in response to resistance, open disobedience by transgender girls and women of coercive, exclusionary norms of cisgender binaries. One example, the Connecticut Civil Court case in the early 2020s demonstrated that white supremacist Christian reasoning can join with misogyny in the targeting of black teenage girls for discrimination and humiliation in the courts. I don't know if you know this case, but it was brought by this extremist Christian legal group called the Alliance Defending Freedom, that's dedicated to systemically enforcing the subjugation of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender queer people. Their mission reflects that Christian vision. On their website, they say this was founded by white evangelical Christian cisgender leaders, and on the Alliance's website, they say, quote, "Our faith instructs us that God created man and woman as complementary equals, and that sex is binary and biologically determined," unquote. 2 transgender black teens were targeted by this group and taken before the court for participating in high school sports. In one especially dramatic moment in the court proceedings, these Christian legal organization lawyers deliberately misgendered these high school black girls by insisting on referring to them as boys. The maliciousness of this tactic these lawyers used in their treatment of these black children was so aggressive that even the judge felt it necessary to call a halt to it and to refer to it as bullying of the youth. But these white Christian leaders showcased racist trans misogyny in the regulation of the meaning of girlhood, in the lawyers' repeated misgendering of the targeted teens as black males, misgendering them as black males, while characterizing them as a threat to the cisgender white teenage girl who was cast as in need of protection that they were representing. Though I just need to quickly add, The Alliance website shows that they later added a student of color among the cisgender girls who was a complainant. But the function of misogyny here is in these kind of coerced restrictions on what kind of Black femaleness deserves human entitlement to moral agency and affirming embodiment, right? This coerced restrictions. What kind of Black femaleness deserves human entitlement to moral agency and affirming embodiment? And of course, the reliance on the justifying claim of a holy mission of furthering God's supposed purpose in cisgender superiority when creating humankind. But what I want to highlight is the resistance in the midst of the subjugation. The resistance in the participation by these Black trans girls in self-affirming, embodied activities of sports practice and competition. Quote, "Running has been so important for my identity, my growth as a person, and my ability to survive in a world that discriminates against me," unquote. Andrea Yearwood, one of the 2 transgender runners at the center of the case, wrote to the court, "Running has been so important to me for my identity, my growth as a person, my ability to survive in the world that discriminates against me. The exhilaration, the joy, the courage of joining the sport of running as a youth and being part of the team and participating that these trans Black girls display, as well as standing up for themselves when targeted and dragged into court by adults, is that act of self-affirmation and communal participation, resisting the racist misogyny, in this case, trans misogyny. It's this kind of bold courage that matters in defying and resisting racist misogyny. So I just want to say a word about solidarity, and then I want to be in conversation with you because you are so super smart, and you can help me expand this conversation in ways that I haven't even thought about. I want to say, just for my own work and evolution, that my thinking about the need to focus on difference, especially influenced by the Black feminist, lesbian, Audre Lorde, the writings of Audre Lorde, that was really pivotal for me, and thinking about the need to understand, the need to really focus on how difference is expressed. But lately, I have begun to not shift, but maybe slightly shift away, but add to that focus. What's the role of the dominant religious tradition to which I am a part? Christianity. How does Christianity specifically propagate what I call just a big old sameness project? That's what Christianity is about, a big old sameness. Now, I want to add cautions here to the kind of resistance I was describing. Now, if I haven't gotten on your last nerve talking about the history of African-American slavery, and specifically breeding practices, and how that is the legacy of all the prosperity that we are enjoying here in this nation, and talking about abortion access, I am about to get on your last nerve, because I am the only Christian ethicist you will encounter who writes against the love ethic. Against the tradition, defining solidarity as loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. All right, hang in there 1 second with me. I know, you're coming for me. I say to students all the time in my class, describe the kind of your vision for social ethics, and you may not use love. Because, if you work on gender violence and intimate violence, right, a whole lot of abuse and cruelty, right, in the name of love occurs, right? And so I find that this process of loving our neighbor as ourselves, for Christians, we are teaching and reinforcing that I can only love others. You can only love others in the way that you love yourself. We can only see the other and the other's worthiness of love when we see ourselves in the other. Right? It's this mirror, loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. We are just looking into that mirror and what's reflected back. I love this quick, I really am wrapping up, just like a preacher. I really am wrapping up, but this Scenes of Subjection, Saidiya Hartman's piece, I just love the way she talks about empathy, and slavery. And just one quick sentence: empathy is a projection of oneself into another in order to better understand the other. Empathy is a projection of oneself into another in order to better understand the other. This kind of loving your neighbor as yourself, projecting yourself into the other. We need a vision of solidarity that's not about how we are the same, how much we are the same. I know every liturgical, right, all of the liturgical scholars and practitioners are saying, right, every communion service, we are one, all of us are one, and in our oneness, there's sameness. But that reinforces this Christian white supremacist project. It reinforces the stench. Christians in particular need to critique it. And, all right, so I was going to say something about betrayals, but I'm going to go just to the need to focus on solidarity as this shared work that's not only about what we have in common, but how we share the work of resistance, our shared interdependence in caring that you get what you want and need, maybe totally different from what I want and need. That you get what you want and what you need for the dignity, because of the dignity and worth to which you are entitled. To which you are entitled. But I fear that my entire entreaty this evening is maybe for naught. It's for naught unless you can smell it. Did I increase the smell a little bit? What was my goal? The pervasiveness of that stench. I want to increase that for you. Thank you. Okay. So I want to talk to you.
The floor is open.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Traci. This was very powerful, and I think it's getting to something in the solidarity term that's especially important for those of us who are trying to resist all of this. So there's a well-meaning way of us, like you said, solidarity, we're all one, solidarity, we all have to work together, identity, marching in lockstep, and so on. And so what I would like to explore, or ask you to explore a little bit further, is how does this solidarity based on diversity really move us forward? Because, there's one side of solidarity, that's the conservative project. That's identity based on race, gender, sexuality, you name it. I mean, nationality. Religion is a huge part of it, right? The assumption that, say, Christians have more in common with other Christians than they would have, say, with other people in the struggle. We talked about that this morning when we had the breakfast, basically saying, you know, maybe a Christian in resistance has more in common with a Jewish person, a Muslim person, a Buddhist in resistance than they would have with other Christians who are claiming this oppressive right-wing solidarity. So I guess my question for you is this solidarity as a conservative misogynist project, obviously there's a problem here, but moving a little bit further with the progressive solidarity. I mean, Fannie Lou Hamer, I think, is a great example here because in some ways, you know, there is solidarity in the Civil Rights Project. Of course, she gets a little frustrated at the end of her life with politics.
She gets
policy
very
work.
frustrated at several points, yeah.
What she does, though, is, cooperatives, right? Freedom farms. She brings working people together, actually building a solidarity that maybe that solidarity and diversity that we're after, I mean, that's sort of what I'm trying to figure out with this notion of deep solidarity. So I'm just wondering if some of this practical work could help us understand sort of, I mean, we need a solidarity movement that's different from right-wing solidarity.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Thank you. I have to constrain myself on Hamer. I know, are there other, I know Charlene is on this, but Hamer, I teach an entire class only on Fannie Lou Hamer. Like 5 days, 6 hours a day, and intensive. And the students, when they come, they're like, that's like all the readings you gave us, like Fannie Lou. Yeah. I mean, there's so much, so amazing resource for that in that leadership and farm, food justice, child labor. I mean, just sexual violence, reproductive. There's just so much there. Anyway, so that's a really important piece. Yeah, and you're helping me clarify because I do see the kind of solidarity work as on my list of not right-wing sort of work, but more what does it mean to shape the response to the misogyny around I was trying to go to the place that, take a quick shortcut where people would say, well, what's the constructive piece that matters? And I think solidarity is the constructive piece, that response. And so, but what does that look like? What does that entail to make it a response that has some like direct relationship to what we're up against? And so that's why I was trying to tease out a couple of pieces, and I have a whole piece on betrayal. Because I think that's also a really important dimension. Like, it's not just the Tim Scott and the Herschel Walker and the Clarence and the not that those kinds of Clarence Thomas and the Black Memphis Police and like the betrayal is really a crucial piece, not just looking at those folks, but the ways in which, how do we recognize the difference between betrayal and difference? Like, Hamer was opposed to abortion rights and based on her experience, right? And birth control, very strongly opposed, right? And so how do we have a sense of when you feel betrayed and when you have a sense of difference and the kind of solidarity and what sort of like what works against it? And I'm trying to name some of those pieces. So anyway, my point is I got a lot to say about this and the kinds of critiques that are necessary, as well as the constructive work, which I think includes recognizing, hearing, listening to the resistance that is occurring and the kind of leadership. Please.
Dr. West, thank you so much for a riveting lecture. You brought so many things to mind. It was just so rich. And I am sitting in just wrestling with your challenge to critically engage love as abusive in the work of liberationist ethics. And to that point, when you ask what is the dominant role of religion in this work that we do, I wanted, and you just dropped it, and that's what's so brilliant about you. Always just drop these little seeds, and we're like, yes, yes, I want to see the fruit. When you said, let's not get bogged down, and I'm going to call it in the love language that we have as scholars, in hiding our genius in the scholarly concepts of people who don't fully get what we're trying to represent. So when you talked about Nancy Fraser's subaltern, that yes, there's use for that, right? There's use as scholar for certain language, but what we see happening even in the public square around the abusive ways in which, as scholars, we fall in love with language that actually deserves, underserves, or undermines the very community of which we're a part. So the way in which we see scholar activists even trying to define woke for people who are making sure that you stay asleep.
Yeah,
Right. That
yes.
For people who actually know what woke is, which is why they don't want you to be woke, and they're sedating you. And there's a part of scholarship for scholar activists that sedates us.
Yeah.
So when I think about what postmodernity has done to the work of women's studies, Black cultural studies, and the subaltern, the same thing. Can you talk a little bit about, whether we're talking about solidarity, even any concept, how do you, as a scholar, activist, practitioner,
Yeah.
in the mainstreaming of faith as a Methodist, right, in a PWI, how do you attend to a critical pedagogy and a rigorous faith that doesn't bend to the death-dealing seductive nature of the love language of scholarship that never has us in mind nor in tow?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my response, I just want to say ashe. I just want to say yes. Yeah, it's so crucial. And I would add, there is this way in which, for me, I'm always like, what are the practices and the activist practices, and also I teach in prison, and I know Janet, I've talked to and have been trained by Janet to what does it mean to go inside and be and have the ideas that I come in with shaped, changed, challenged, turned around as I am in making those kinds of theory practice connections constantly. I also think preachers and the love piece, I'm often challenging Christian leaders with what is what I call sort of greeting card ethics, this kind of go forth and love everybody. That's what we have to do, is just love everybody. What does that mean? And especially, I'm ashamed to be a United Methodist. I know that upsets many of you who are United Methodists, but I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed to be a United Methodist. It is shameful. The traditional plan in the United Methodist Church and the targeting.
But even
of
in those contexts, right, you cracked open the liturgy.
and
I mean, nothing is too sacred for you to touch, and to literally say, if we're going to claim it, we can interrogate it.
yeah, but I have to say the place where I am so influenced so much is gender violence, and so the reason I am talking about betrayal, because there's nobody who understands betrayal more than people who have been impacted by gender violence, whether it is the trust that they had in their pastor who's sexually assaulting and sexually harassing, their doctor, their therapist, their professor, their father, their grandfather, right? And so to understand how we attend to that kind of, we were talking about trauma this morning, that kind of trauma and its impacts, but also the kind of political mobilization that is that that we have to shift in order to have a response that's not merely responding after the harm and the violence has been perpetrated, which is also from that kind of work on gender violence. Anyway, so I could listen to you and talk with you for a long time, but I want to be attentive and to hear more of you. And this is new for me to try and think about particularly the reproductive piece in conversation with the gender violence piece.
I want to echo, it's just a brilliant talk, so suggestive and elusive in so many ways. I'm one of those preachers that's stuck on the love. So let me just say this. Maybe it's because of Motown more than theology, but more Smokey Robinson than Motown. But look, I think that, because the thing is, does solidarity really relieve the hermeneutical problem, the problem of knowledge and creation of empathy that love, as you have brilliantly talked about it, has failed to do? Because solidarity in this state, you talk about it, there is crucial solidarity among factions of white supremacists who have forged connection as a theological truth for them, right? Whether it's against CRT, now it's with drag queens, and then the way in which they drag blackness into the matter as well, right? So inadvertently underscoring the way in which blackness has been queered from the very beginning, because ain't nothing natural about looking at people's testicles and looking at them for durability or to further the telos of agrarian capital that you brilliantly began with. But I'm trying to figure out how solidarity avoids the pitfalls of the language of love, the abuses of it, to be certain. And is there a way to recoup, to restore and redeem the advantage of a radical insistence on love as purging the frailties and the flaws that you have brilliantly pointed to without surrendering the ethic of love altogether? Because I think that the very community that has been most stringently abused sexually, morally, and politically is the very community that depends upon and continues to inform that love ethic in ways that the culture refuses to hear. So I feel like G.K. Chesterton, it ain't that Christianity has been tried and failed. It ain't been tried. It ain't that love has failed. It ain't really been tried in the fundamental way. But I know you got good stuff to say on that.
Yeah, no, I'm listening to you. I hear you. I'm trying to, I guess I'm trying to envision how do we do this resistance work, and I think this love ethic stuff just is so morally bankrupt, drained of its authority in so many ways, and so how and in part I'm going especially to the loving your neighbor as yourself, because I'm especially interested in how do we do this work so that you're forming a relatedness that is productive for wholeness and worth and dignity. And so often Christians, U.S. Christianity anyway, is just about looking back at oneself. So I just want to really challenge that. So you can't ever actually get a movement off the ground because on the love ethic, because you're always really just talking about yourself and what is good for you and what feels good for you, and you're always only seeing your neighbor. I only see you when I can see me, and if I can't see me, then I can't see you. And one of the things I just want to say about the drag queen. The targeting of drag queen, that it's like my example of the kids, the black trans girls running, because it's so much about self-affirmation. And it's about this joy in self-affirmation. And so targeting that joy in self-affirmation and what that is teaching, the boldness of it, and especially the ways in which femaleness is conveyed in this complex and joyful transgender fluidity in that self-affirmation. So that's, again, I guess, how did I go there? Because it's that sense of, well, I can't see how I'm gendered and how you're gendered.
Right.
Then I can't find my way towards loving you in this loving my neighbor as myself thing.
Well, what about, just very briefly, that's a brilliant response. Then I'm thinking about those preachers who get up, since you have tagged us and you're right, who get up and say, crucify me, right? Obliterate me, destroy all that is not you, so that in me is reflected the divine. Now, we know that's porous. We know it's limited. We know it's shaded by all kinds of, metaphysical priorities and biases that are rarely explicitly articulated. But it is not the mere appeal to self in other. It is the God in you recognizing the God in me. Now, that could be a kind of a semantic throw-off that really doesn't ultimately deal with the sense of betrayal to which you point, but I do think that there is some possibility that the self to which you make reference has been or could be reconstructed in light of its relationship to the divine. However we consider that, however we construct that makes a hell of a difference, that it's not simply the self seeking the reflection of oneself and the other, a kind of abortive narcissism. It's also about transformative praxis where we have the real ability to see God in the other. That's one. And then with the trans stuff, I'm thinking about transubstantiation, right, and translation, two critical components of the biblical text that could be appropriated in your work, I think, for the defense of a trans identity. But I just...
We have time for one more question. Jara.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that all the things are kind of bubbling in terms of thoughts, but I'm sticking to the stench. And I think that what we do is tiptoe around the stench instead of actually sometimes, in terms of as we're trying to talk about solidarity and love, it's the addressing of the stench that does the work of resistance and the recognition of it. And I think that that's also just very powerful, because I'm thinking about a lot of sayings in Spanish about pestes, about stenches, and the ways that we don't recognize our own stench. So in that way, right, when we're mirroring and doing that kind of work of solidarity, what does it mean when, we're the ones that stink?
Yeah. Because it just saturates our moral sensibilities, sense of vision. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good. Thank you.
One of the things that we do with the lectureship, is we get the poster for the lectureship framed. And so we will do that and send it to you. And I assume you've seen the...
Yes, it's so great. I just saw it. Yes, thank you so much.
So you will be getting that additional reminder as well as a little something.
All right. Good.
So, folks, please, there's food and drink out in the atrium. Enjoy yourselves. And thank you so much, Dr. West.
Thank you.